heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 228, covering the week of August 17th through August 21st, 2020. Glad to have you back in the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Abbeville Institute, like our Facebook page at Abbeville Institute, and subscribe to our YouTube page at Abbeville Institute. You can find all those social media accounts at our webpage. That's abbevilleinstitute.org. That's Abbeville, institute.org. While you're there, give us an email address. We'll give you a free ebook, Exploring the Southern Tradition. It's a great book, 20 essays in defense of the Southern tradition by Abbeville Institute scholars. And of course, it is your gift simply for signing up to our email list. You'll get our daily dose of Dixie Monday through Friday, which is a great way to keep up with what we're doing here at the Institute. If you like what we do, if you like our podcast, our conferences, our website, all the things that we have, and of course, future projects, our publications, there are lots of things we're working on. You can support the Institute by clicking on that support tab at the webpage, abbevilleinstitute.org. You can donate monthly, annually, or a one-time gift. It is tax deductible to the full extent of the law. So if you, again, want to help us out financially, we exist on your generous contributions alone. You can do that at abbevilleinstitute.org. You can also click on that little Amazon button at the top of the page. If you shop at Amazon, every time you shop at Amazon, if you click on that button, we become your preferred charity. So they give us a few bucks every time you shop there. So that's a great way to support the Institute and painless for you. Also, download our app. Go to your app store. It's free of charge. Get your Abbeville Institute on the go. So you can get this podcast through the app. You can get our lectures, over 200 lectures, free of charge. The app is free of charge. Everything we're doing here that I'm talking about is free of charge, which is why we ask for contributions. We don't sell anything that doesn't go back into the kitty for helping produce all of this stuff. So please continue to support the Institute. Share our material on social media. If you like this podcast, rate it wherever you get your podcasts, and let people know you like what we do. Also, get your Abbeville Institute apparel. Click on that shop tab at the website, and you get your embroidered materials. Great stuff. So you can advertise the Institute, and also we get a few pennies out of that too. So it's all there to help our cause. Now, let's talk about the cause, because that's what we're here for. I want to start with the last piece of the week. It's by Phil Lee. It's Idiotic Idioms. Now, this is something that's interesting. The language of history is changing. And I think this is a very subtle but important thing to talk about. Now, in the last 20 years, there has been one major change in the way that historians have categorized time. It used to be that you talked about AD and BC. Now it's BCE and CE. We have the Common Era and before Common Era. This was a change that started taking place in textbooks. You started seeing the AD designation done away with and BC. And we started seeing CE and BCE. So that was a subtle thing to take Christianity, of course, out of any type of mainstream history curriculum. You just get rid of the AD in the year of our Lord, and you replace it with Common Era, before Common Era, and Common Era. And most people just said, oh yeah, we'll do that. They embraced it. Historians embraced it. Now, a lot of historians, of course, we have to remember, are anti-Christian. The profession is eaten up with it. Most historians are lefties. Many of them are communists, and they are fine with this Common Era designation because at some point, I mean, look, the way history is going in America, we're going to have to start history textbooks in 1975. It's why in my McClanahan Academy, if you're listening to this, I have an educational website, McClanahan Academy, which you have to purchase the courses. But one of my courses on Reconstruction, I talk about that. Look, Reconstruction continued to 1975, and in so many ways, I could continue the class up to this point, but I stopped there and made references to what's going on now. It's just a continuation of what we saw in the last half of the 20th century. But that, I think, would be the goal. You start in 1975. Look, this is the French Revolution. We're seeing the French Revolution brought to America. And I know it's, oh, this is nothing like the French Revolution. Blah, blah, blah. This is nothing like that. It is. Because what you're seeing is complete assault on memory. This is why when you have someone like David Blight write his book on memory studies. That's the key, you see, because the way that Southerners remember the past is wrong. That's incorrect memory. You can't remember it like that because you're wrong. So you have to remember it like we tell you to remember it. You see, this is the subtle key to all of this. David Blight wants you to remember the war the way he wants you to remember the war. He wants you to remember Reconstruction the way he wants you to remember Reconstruction, which is all part of a Lincolnian nationalist agenda. Remember it the way I tell you to remember it, because the way you remember it is incorrect. Now, if you look at John Lukács and his definition of history, he would say history is the remembered past. In fact, all of history is the remembered past. So this idea of memory studies is just so you're studying history. This is how stupid this really is, but oh, this is so new. This is so wonderful. David Blight is on the cutting edge. David Blight is a moron for coming up with something that already exists. It's called history. And history is the remembered past, and people remember things differently. If we're really interested in diversity, in studying the way people think about things, and acceptance and tolerance, well then the way that Southerners remember the past would be tolerated because it's correct. And of course, there's plenty of documents. By saying that there's memory studies and there's different memories, I mean, that might get to people that think that I would say that there is no truth in history. Of course there is. But the fact is, the way Southerners remember the past is being destroyed by those who would say that you're remembering it incorrectly. This is why we have to take down your monuments, we have to take down your symbols, we have to tell you everything in your past is wrong and incorrect and evil and bad. And you have to accept our version of history. You might as well be the North Koreans. Might as well. You might as well be the Stalinists, because that's exactly what they did. This is what George Orwell was writing about in 1984. I saw somebody the other day with a slogan, make Orwell fiction again. I love that. Make Orwell fiction again instead of reality. That was great. Because this is what we're living in. We're living in an Orwellian nightmare. And the way language is used is indicative of that. And so Phil Lee brings up some of this stuff. And I want to talk about a couple of points that he made. One is enslaved people. Now, this is relatively recent, say in the last decade. But it used to be you wrote about the history of slavery, you wrote about slaves. No, you can't say that anymore because slaves is passive. And I've read articles about this. I saw when this was starting to happen. And you started seeing it in academic papers and dissertations and other things. Starting using the term enslaved, because if you say slave, the idea, now Phil Lee says this, and I'll get into what I say. He says, another example is nearly mandatory is enslaved people instead of slaves. The true meaning is the same, but presently the first expression is a codified way of signaling the writer's awareness that slavery was evil. It simultaneously and falsely implies that those who do not use the term deny the evil in slavery. In reality, everyone knows that slavery was and remains wicked. There's no valid need for another torture construction to restate the obvious. But this is the point. It's not the same in their mind. You see, slaves to them is passive. This is a passive thing. These people were just slaves. It's a passive institution. Benign almost is what they would say by it. And of course, that's not true. As Phil Lee says, it's not true. But if you use enslaved, that's an active thing. That is saying this is an active oppression of people. You're enslaved. Now, the only people that actually, we'll run an article on this. The real rubber hit the road with enslaving people in Africa itself. When the slaves were forcibly taken by other Africans in Africa to be sold into the trade. And this is something that even left-wing historians know. The Thornton book, which I recommend to anyone, is fantastic on the transatlantic slave trade. And Thornton was not writing it, and he was actually writing it as a positive book, not that slavery is positive, but that these African societies were not just pushed over by white Europeans, that they dominated the trade, they dictated the terms, they did everything with it. So that term enslaving people would imply that all these people were physically enslaved all the time. They were not being constantly denied their freedom. Now, of course, this is true. They were being denied their freedom, but slaves count, it says the same thing. Okay? So this is not to excuse slavery. No one would. No one with half a brain in the modern era would excuse slavery. But as Phil Lee points out, if you don't use the proper terms, then you're called these things. The other one he says is problematic. This is one. Also, another term used to be disturbed. Disturbed. I'm disturbed by that. This is disturbing. The way you said that is highly disturbing. It's disturbing. That was very popular in the 90s, and my roommate and I in graduate school used to talk about that. This is disturbing. This is disturbed, because that's what the lefties were using back then. Now it's problematic. Now the term, this is problematic. This is a problematic understanding. This is problematic. This is a problematic interpretation of our past. Problematic. As Phil Lee says, explaining that the typical rebel soldier fought to defend his homeland because 70% of Confederates did not own slaves is problematic, because the first 7 cotton states seceded to protect slavery. That makes the defense of the homeland motive false and a blasphemous denial that the Civil War was all about slavery, you see? So it's problematic. These are problematic things that we have to address. They're problematic, and we'll just sweep it aside. Or it's disturbing. Disturbing was a little different, because this is something that you said that they didn't like, so that was disturbing. This is the precursor to cancel culture and, suppression of any voices that aren't fitting the narrative. As Tom Woods calls it, the 3x5 index card of allowable opinion. Those things are disturbing. Problematic are things that don't fit their narrative. So, this is great. I mean, the language we use matters. And of course, things that are just adopted, we're just going to use that term, that changes context, it changes everything. Language is power and how we use these things. Now, I remember back in the 80s when Tipper Gore was trying to get language removed from music and other things, and Frank Zappa would get up there and say, well, these are just words. Well, it is true they're just words. But at the same time, those words do change the culture, because as something gets accepted, well, then it becomes just mainstream, and you accept that meaning that had been used. And I remember as a kid, I was not allowed to say certain things that are now acceptable in modern society. My parents would say, I can't say that. I'm not allowed to say these things. But now those words are acceptable in modern society and mainstream. You just say them. No big deal. So, this is important to understand, and why I wanted to start with this piece. And when you look at the piece before that, The Shaping of Modern American History, where you have a lengthy quotation, block quote from the UDC, and that is going into Lost Cause myth, Mildred Lewis Rutherford, in her book on the war, The Truths of History. She wrote it in 1920. But when you look at what she wrote, and you look at how she explained in 1920 what was happening in America, and what do I mean by that? Well, in 1920, she was talking about how Southern history was being distorted by Northern historians, and she gave several examples of that. I talked about in a piece a long time ago about a man named Cousins, who in the 1880s was writing that history was being distorted, the history of the South and the war, and not just, that little bit, but everything about the South was being distorted by Northerners. And this is the same case here with Miss Rutherford's book. Now, Mildred Rutherford is despised by the mainstream historical profession because they say that she made stuff up. Now, I could honestly say that Miss Rutherford had some problems in her history at times, that she said things that wait a second here, I don't think that's true. But at the same time, she's spot on that what was happening with the historical profession in 1920 has only been put on steroids 100 years later. You see, this is where historiography, and if you study historiography, and the first piece of the week is on historiography on Lee, this is where when you look at these things, you see that there is a tremendous distortion. Oftentimes, in historiography. You see, who writes it matters. Who wrote the history matters. If a communist writes a history, typically it's going to have that kind of slant. You see this a lot with, say, the French Revolution. You can hardly find a book on the French Revolution that's not written by a communist today. I remember when I was, again, in graduate school taking the courses of Owen Connolly, who was one of the few non-communist French revolutionary historians in the world. The expert on Napoleon in America, at the very least. And this was the case, and he constantly talked about this. He said, look, you can't really find a non-communist book on the French Revolution. They just don't exist. The communists are drawn to it because it's their thing. You see, simply what you choose to write about often shows who you are as a person. And look, my biases are up front. I've always been open about my biases. I tell you what my biases are. I am open about what I think about things. And so when people listen to me or they look at the Abbeville Institute, which our biases are open, well, they know what they're going to get, right? I'm not pretending to be something I'm not. I will tell you what I think about things, and I try to give you, I give you the other side, or I say, well, look, there's some merit to this. Well, I'm being honest. At the end of the day, though, my biases are out front for everyone to see. You can't say the same with most people in the profession. They pretend to be objective, but they're really not. In fact, there's a great book about this by a guy named Novick. It's That Noble Dream, The Search for Objectivity in History. There is no objectivity in history. It's not there. To say that Rutherford was biased is true, but then to say that these other people aren't biased is false. You're creating a false dichotomy. Southerners are biased and they lie. Northerners are not biased and they tell the truth. It's a false dichotomy. It's almost like when you get to the war. The war was about slavery. If you say the war is about slavery, that would mean that the South was fighting for slavery and the North was fighting against it, which we know wasn't true. It creates a false dichotomy. The war was about preservation of the Union. The war was about preserving the Union. Now, we can say, why was it for preserving the Union? But simply, the war was about preventing secession. It was about preventing the South from leaving. They weren't allowed. That was what the war was about. Now, we can talk about secession. We can talk about motivations for going to war, the underlying motivation for it, but the entire point was to keep the Union together for various reasons, or to not have the Union for various reasons. But the war itself, shooting each other, was about preventing secession. That's clear from the beginning. Preventing the self-determination of the southern states, for whatever reason. This is when you get into the thing, well, did they have a valid reason for self-determination? We can say they should have had self-determination, but we have to agree with the reasoning that they want self-determination. Now you're splitting hairs. People should have the ability to declare their self-determination, their independence at any time under the American principle of self-determination. That's why there's a new book out. A lefty wrote it, but it's about breaking up the Union and how this is as American as anything you can get. I mean, it's wonderful. We're having more discussions of secession all the time. Now, Mildred Lewis Rutherford said that, the South doesn't get the credit for a lot of things. See, already in 1920, the memory of the South was being reinterpreted. The memory of the South was being reinterpreted. And this has become the lost cause myth, when in reality, the myth really is the righteous cause myth. And as Clyde Wilson has pointed out, what is a myth anyways? It's a set of beliefs. It doesn't have to be false. It's just a myth. A myth doesn't have to be false. It can be true. But it's the stories of a people. That's a myth. The stories of a people. And sometimes we see that when myths are told, well, my gosh, we found that some of this was actually true. Oh, well, then it's not really a myth. If a falsity, is it? It's just a story. So when you look at the piece on Monday, False Story Historiography, and I've done a piece like this as well, Robert E. Lee versus Twitter Historians. Jerry Lafergie did essentially the same thing. And it's wonderful that we have someone like Jerry writing for us. He's writing from Australia. We have people all over the world that are attracted to the Southern tradition. We get people that email us. Had somebody email us the other day. He's a Korean living in America. And he's attracted, this is not the first, he's attracted to the Southern tradition because of what it means. Because he can see in it parallels between North and South Korea. He can see it. And the traditional part of it, the preservation of permanent things, he sees that as a beautiful thing. That's great. You see, the tradition is timeless. It is in of itself. It's timeless for what it means for all people, all over the world. That's the beautiful thing about the tradition and why people gravitate to it that start looking at these things. It's why I gravitated to it at one point. Because the other side is the neoconservative side, which is, the Lincolnian nationalism. It's destructive. It's destructive of tradition. Now, I know the Lincolnian nationalists, the neoconservatives say, no, we're preserving these ideals. This is the same thing Barack Obama said, but he said it a couple of days ago. That's part of remaking America, reinventing America. Those ideals are constantly reinventing things and destroying the permanent things. And so when you look at Lee, he has to be destroyed because he represents permanent things. He represents old Virginia. There is now a bill before Congress to take the Lee Memorial designation off of Arlington House because, of course, Lee is bad. He has to be done away with. And I'm sure it will actually gain some traction, even among neoconservatives. Oh, yeah, we don't need that. But where do conservatives, quote unquote, actually grow a backbone and say, no, we're not doing that. Shut up. You're stupid. That's what needs to be said. No, we're not doing that. Shut up. Just go away. Shut up. You're stupid. Where do we do that? Where do they start doing these things? Where do we start drawing the line? I loved it that the Federalist the other day, somebody actually called out the conservatives. This is a neoconservative site. They called out the neoconservatives. You're the reason that Confederate monuments are coming down. You're the reason that other monuments are coming down. It's you. If you had just grown a backbone and said, no, we're not taking down Lee. We're not taking down any of this stuff. We're not doing it. We're leaving it all there. We're leaving it. You can just shut up and go away. Stop acting like a bunch of petulant little children and be quiet. Well, if they had done something like that, the adults are talking now. The kids just need to go away. If they had done something like that, we wouldn't be seeing George Washington torn down in Los Angeles. Statue of George Washington. Wouldn't see Columbus coming down. We wouldn't see Caesar Rodney coming down in Wilmington. Caesar Rodney. I mean, this is how stupid this stuff is, right? It's just constant. We're going to take more, we're going to take more, we're going to take more. And that's because of David Blight and all these morons that run around with memory studies. One memory is wrong, one memory is right. So this attack on Lee is part of that. Now, this piece by Lafergie is great in that it lays out all the different interpretations of Lee in the last 20 years or so, and really gets into the counterweight to that, which is all the stuff that's already been said before about Lee. And of course, Lafergie comes down the side of Lee. This false story historiography is just that. It's false. There is truth in Lee, but it's not what the left is portraying Lee to be. Lee was a man. As a man, he has faults. And everyone knew this, even in the South. There were even, if you look at the agrarians, they were critical privately of Lee, the Lee story. They thought that, Lee was maybe being shown as too perfect of a man. And so they liked men like Forrest and others who they thought were just as important as Lee, but not getting the same type of publicity. But regardless, they were even questioning some of the, marble man theories of Lee, that he was beyond reproach. But certainly, saying that Lee was a great man is not a stretch. Lee was a great man. He was a great Christian Southern gentleman with faults. No one that says that Lee is a great man doesn't recognize the man is a man, and that as all man, he is fallen and he has faults. Everyone does. But he did great things. He was magnanimous. And so, and this is why Americans for years recognized him as a great American, not just a great Southerner, but a great American. It's why Stonewall Jackson, it's why E.L. Godkin, the conservative Northerner who wrote during the war that when Jackson is remembered, he will be remembered as an American. Not just a Southerner, but an American. America produced Stonewall Jackson. And he really admired Jackson. Many Northerners really admired Jackson. So this is the problem with the current attack on the South and its history, because this is the point. You change the language, you change the memory, you write the false story. And you forget about things that might have been unsavory, problematic, disturbing. There are people that want to take, and there was a story about this, I can't remember where it was, but a principal was shown throwing books from the library in the dumpster because those books aren't the history that they want to know. The Democrat convention brought this up. There's history we don't need to be taught anymore. We don't need to be taught that history because it's not favorable to us, or it's not favorable to our people, or whatever. So it needs to go. We just throw those books in the trash and we start over. This is the point. It's why, even Google doing things like putting books out there online, I wonder how long they're going to leave some of those things there. Now, hopefully Google and the Internet Archive and other things have a little more integrity than to say, well, those books are unsavory, let's get rid of them. But this is Fahrenheit 451. You've got people in Oregon burning the Bible. They're burning books. They don't care about books. They don't care about reading things. Those things challenge what they say, and they can't have that. I tell people all the time, read things that challenge what you think. You need to sharpen your pencil. Maybe you were wrong about some things. I don't know. But you need to sharpen your pencil. And if you don't believe those things and you think that here it is, well then read the stuff that challenges you. Don't just read the stuff you agree with. Read the stuff that challenges you. That is being a true academic. And so I read things that challenge what I think all the time, because it's fruitful for your education, for your academic endeavors. Now, the last thing I want to talk about this week is this little piece, The Simple Things, by Travis Holt. And I want to read this little piece. It's not long, because this essentially is what we need to do now. I know we've had the piece three weeks in a row, James Roach talking about what we need to do now, but this is such a simple way of looking at it. He says, I was raised in one of the poorest counties in northwest Arkansas, where my ancestors settled in the 1850s and scratched a living out of poor rocky hillsides. They raised their families, fought in the war, battled famine and drought, and came out ahead, leaving their children small, improved farms. They taught them the joy of being independent, finding solace and comfort in hard work and a job well done, and the importance of passing these things to their children. They were proud, hard-working toilers who expected nothing from anyone save like treatment and despised government intervention into their affairs, much like most of the southern mountaineers and settlers. The northwest corner of Arkansas was poor in money, but rich in character and natural resources. Here they would make their stand. Of course, my experience was different. By the time I came along in the late 80s, my great-grandparents were aging, but they kept up the old ritual of gardening and canning until they were physically unable to do so anymore. To this day, the cellar at their home, which they built with their own hands and completed in 1956, is stocked with canned goods. Growing up, I was intrigued by what they did, but didn't get involved outside of maybe walking the rows of corn behind my great-grandmother. My great-grandfather died when I was 10. My grandparents raised a little garden, but mainly subsided on what they bought or got from their grandparents. Ditto my parents. We had a token garden living in the country, but didn't place great importance on it, though it was oft discussed how important it was. But words and actions are two different things. Fast forward some years, and I marry into a family in the county of north of us, even closer to Missouri, and we began having children and starting a home of our own. My lifetime of knowing gardening and like things were important is still with me and becomes more clear to me as I lose the older generations about me. My great-grandfather passed, and then my grandfather and his brothers. Soon my link to the past is all but gone from me. Though I long ago accepted I was the family historian, being blessed and growing up literally across the creek from where my fourth great-grandfather homesteaded, and survived an assassination attempt during the war, but that's a story for another time, and collected pictures, interviews, and documents, the practical side of traditions was sadly lost upon me. However, my wife had a very different approach. Her family were farmers and dedicated to what is today referred to homesteading, and she practiced it with a dedication bordering, admittedly at times, psychotic. Don't you ever tell her I said that. She soon had me helping in the garden. I began to enjoy the weed pulling, harvesting, and planting that went along with the declining grocery bill, not to mention the healthfulness of eating what you grow over what you buy in the local supermarket. But it wasn't until we got into strawberries that it really hit me. We planted 2 rows of ever-bear strawberries to do something different. We also got into fruit trees at the same time, but that's in a fruit future project. When they started producing, and Lord, did they produce, we began picking nearly daily. We started involving the children in the harvesting since it was a lighter task, and we both agreed it was immensely important that they began to learn such things for use in their lives. One evening after we harvested a bucket of strawberries, and man, those things are amazing. I've always said I didn't care for strawberries because all I'd ever had were store-bought ones. We settled down on the patio in the shade to relax and have supper. It was right about then that it hit me. I'd spent so much of my young life chasing material things, and still guilty of that, but I never truly picked up on the physical, here and now concepts of what is truly important. I'm giving my children what my ancestors taught their children. The concepts of planting, harvesting, and the joy and reward of a day's hard work. My wife excels in canning and processing food, and we always have a stocked pantry of food for a rainy day. My grandmother tells me that my great-grandfather would have absolutely loved my wife, had she lived long enough to meet her, because their outlook is so similar. But cheesy as it may seem, life is truly about the simple things. Your family, your community, the ability to have independence, even if it's small scale, is still a good start. Traditions that I work to preserve, I have, but this is one that was never taught to me, and I nearly lost it. Keep that in mind with your children and your family. These things will die if not passed on. Sitting here in the cool of our patio, watching my children enjoy their strawberries, I could close my eyes and see my great-grandparents do the same as they watched the children who became my grandparents enjoy the fruits of their labor and the land. Blood and soil is a real concept, and it is still there for the taking. God bless you and yours, and may Dixie's eternal light and the light of our strong Southern families perpetually shine. Lose not faith, but when you become down or get frustrated on something you can't change, work on something you can change. Start small, and you will work forward to larger things. Keep your faith, your family, and your hope. It's a beautiful, quick summary of what the Southern tradition really is. It's people in place. It's community. It's continuity between generations. It's the remembered past. Regardless of what Blight says, the people that remember it here in this part of Arkansas know that they're right. And that's why I wanted to read this little piece. Until next time, good day.